Brooklyn. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So yeah, as Brooklyn mentioned, I'm the small fruit extension specialist. I don't know how many of you know, but Georgia is one of the largest blueberry producers in the United States. So a lot of my research is mainly centered on blueberries. However, blackberry production has been increasing in the state of Georgia. So I started working with blackberries. As soon as I started in this position, I've been with the University of Georgia for almost 3 years, and very happy to do this work. Very happy to talk to people that are interested in growing brambles. I have to say that mainly in Georgia, we grow blackberries. Raspberries are probably most of the time grown in like the backyards or for like homeowners, but we don't have per se an industry. So a lot of my research mainly is on like blueberries and blackberries. There is a lot of interest on raspberries and growing raspberries in Georgia. However, most of our crops are grown in the south part of the state. And when it gets, humidity in black and raspberries need cold temperatures. So, but having said that, I was in a recent scientific meeting 2 weeks ago, and they show growing raspberries in Mississippi. So I'm gonna probably start doing something on raspberry and see what varieties and what cultivars will be adapted for South Georgia. So with further, won't hold you long. Okay, my mouse wasn't working. So now, just a little bit of information. As I said, when I started in 2021, we had about 800 acres of blackberries. By now, we have about 1,200 acres. So we are increasing every year on blackberry production. And as you can see there on the graph on your screen, you see like a demand on growth for brambles. So raspberry in particular had increased a lot in demand, and then blackberry follows raspberries. So the industry is increasing, that the demand consumption is increasing, and that means that is going to reflect on the amount of acreage that we are going to plant as a state and in general in the whole country. One of the largest producers of blackberries in the United States, it's Oregon. So blackberry variety. So as I said, we don't specifically have a breeding program for blackberries in Georgia. So a lot of the varieties that are planted in Georgia, and particularly in South Georgia, as you can see the map, most of the blackberries, for large production, it's planted in South Georgia. All of those cultivars on those large scale productions, and probably some of the cultivars that you get when you want to plant some blackberries at your house, they come from the Arkansas breeding program, one of the largest breeding programs in the United States. And actually, the breeding program provides genetic material for a lot of areas in the world, like Mexico and other areas. And so, as I said, mostly it's concentrated for us in South Georgia, and our season goes from mid-May to mid-July. So we have a very short season. So now that I gave you kind of like where the market is going, where the genetic material comes from, I'm going to talk to you, why you need to consider before you decide to plant blackberries. So as Brooklyn was saying, before you were talking, I think you had a Zoom meeting or a training on soils. So this is also going to be part of it, because the soil is very important when you decide to plant any type of crop. So, but also what other things that you need to consider besides soil is, the region. Where are you located? Like in the scale of, are you located in the North Hemisphere, the South Hemisphere? That is very important. The microclimate of the location where you're at, and then the microclimate. So we start big, as I have that graph right there, the figure on the region, the microclimate, the microclimate, and then the resources, and then you go specific to the site where you're specifically doing that plant. And so all those things are very important, and I'll talk a little bit more, more detail about each of those. So, and then it's also very important that you know that you have water available for your plant, because you don't want to plant and then water is not available and then plants need water. And that is also very important to know the latitude you are, that the feeds, the elevation you're located, you're in the tropic, in the subtropics. So all of those things that you probably don't think much when you decide to plant brambles, you need to think so that way you can better accommodate your plant, your variety for that. Once again, so the region, the microclimate, it's important to know the latitude you are in. And why it's important? Because plants have all the metabolic and physiological process linked to light. So, and light, the amount of light they receive, depending upon in what latitude they are, is going to affect their growth. So that is why it's very important. Sometimes we don't think, oh, I'm just going to plant this in probably it's a variety of genetic material that it's not suitable for us. So, that's why sometimes, we wonder why we cannot grow avocados here, in Georgia, or some other crops that they don't grow here very well. So that is all because of the photoperiod. That's how we call it. Plant scientists call it photoperiod, is the amount of light, hours of light plants get exposed to. So also it's very important to know how close you're to the mountains, the lakes, the ocean. So all of that, all of those considerations, it's gonna help you to determine what cultivar, what variety, what genetic material, what type of plant you're gonna use. Enable to, for growers, for example, it will be to have profits, right? To harvest and have higher yields. For you as a homeowner, it will be, to have something to taste because you want that plant to produce fruit. So those are also important. So hardening the sun, it's something that it's, kind of like in the same topic of learning about your location. You want to know how cold it gets where you are. Once again, going to the example of the avocados, and avocados is my favorite fruit, after, before blueberries and then after blackberries. So I have avocados, blueberries, and blackberries. And so why we cannot plant avocados here? Because it gets too cold, but it gets also very hot. So it's very important to know those temperatures, those hardness zone, to be able to say, okay, this is the variety that I need. This is the plant I'm going to plant. This is the type of, cultivar or variety I'm going to be, and I'm going to decide to plant because this is what is going to give me the best outcome. So that is why it's very important. So this is the new U.S. plant hardness zone map that just was released. It was released at the end of 2023. So it is very important because you don't want it to get cold when your plants are blooming, for example, and that's something we have to deal with, at the large scale production. I don't know how many of you know this, but like last year, Georgia lost almost, I think, 90% of the peach crop because we had a spring freeze when all those peaches were blooming. The year before that, we had that 50% of the blueberries were, damaged because of a spring freeze. So it's very important because temperature allows the plant to develop. So we have something that is called chill units, that it's the amount of cold that plant had received, and that is used for the plant to bloom. So then when it gets cold, then after that it gets hot, and then the plant blooms. So we call it chilling units and growing degree hours, which is, that's the way we call it, to track how many hours of chill that plant had received in order to break dormancy. So it is very important, and that helps us to keep track with phenological stages, and also it helps us to mitigate any adverse weather conditions such as spring freezes. So it's very important to know the coldest that it gets in your zone where you're located. One other thing that is very important is soil quality, or in your soil, right? Because we cannot change the soil after we plant. We can only change the soil before we plant. So doing your soil samples, as you can see, you can, that's if you have those, you can go in like kind of like in an X to do that soil sample, to take that soil sample with your probe and send it to your lab. So that way you know what pH is your soil, what nutrients your soil have. You can also know, if there are any diseases. For example, I know in the case you can have any root rots, if there's any fungi there that could, probably constrain the root to grow. You can any nematodes. So all of that it's taken care of before you plant by doing a soil sample. Also, there is a lot of issues in the soil sometimes when the soil is being, farmed for several years. Some of the growers fumigate the soil. I sometimes don't recommend it. If there is a new planting, there is no need to do that. But sometimes when that farm has been planted with the same crop several times, it is best to fumigate. And this is again for large scales. How do you plant? This is a blackberry field right there you have on the picture. Roads should be oriented north-south to increase light interception. Remember, we need light, plants need light to do photosynthesis and to also cause a flower induction. So to have those flower buds kind of like ready to bloom, or those vegetative buds going into flower buds. So it's west if the plants on the under high tunnels. We don't have high tunnel production, blackberry high tunnel production here. And also for blackberries, we use trellis. As you can see there, we have a trellis type of like on a V shape. So that also helps mitigate wind damage. Going back into trellises, all these trellises is what we use here in Georgia. This is a kind of like a V trellis, and we see, as you can see, that you have the plant in the middle of those two posts that are on like a V shape, and it provides better light. It gives light onto the two sides of the canopy, and it's just very useful, and it's one of the less expensive type of trellising. Here, there is this, it's kind of like a modification, a Georgia modification, I will call it, that is not, this is not seen in like other states such as North Carolina, but this is something that how growers grow blueberries here in the state. And as you can see, it's kind of like a T, double T type of post. You have the wires that are kind of like hooked into those T's. So you have four, two on the top and two on the bottom, and then the plant it's also in the middle, and then you have these T-posts every, I think like every 10 to 15 plants. This is a different type of trellising system that is not as commonly used, but is very effective, and it's used in the states up north where they grow blackberries. And it's called a rotating cross arm, because you can see that it's kind of like hard to see, but it is a post that it moves, it goes down, as you can see on the other picture. On the picture on the right side of your screen, you will see kind of like just standing up, and then on the picture on the left, you see it how it is below. It lowers down. So usually this type of trellising system is used, as I said, in colder climates, because they can use covers to cover that plant so it doesn't get injured by the cold. Kind of like increasing the temperature, making the plant warm to avoid any injury by the low temperatures. So the spacing, between the rows, some people space it between 9 to 12 feet. It all depends on, what type of layout they have. The plants are spaced between 2.5 to 3 feet. Here is very important, especially, we highly recommend it for larger scale growers to have plants that are virus-free, and the plants that are virus-free, the only ones are the tissue culture plants, because usually blackberries, blackberries are a hybrid, and they have a lot of viruses. And so that is very important to have a tissue culture plant. That way, that material is clean and won't affect, the virus won't affect any yield or quality. So We have 9 to 12 feet between row and 2.5 to 3 feet between plant. There is also some primocane fruiting cultivars. And what do I mean by primocane fruiting cultivars? And that's something probably I should have talked to you before I deal into this, but that blackberries are usually grown on a floricane. So when we harvest blackberries, that cane where we're harvesting from, it's called a floricane. But the year before that, that floricane was a primocane. So the primocane is the vegetative form of cane, and then the following year that becomes a floricane. So the Arkansas breeding program had developed a type of blackberry that is a primocane blackberry. That means that it sets fruit on the primocane. And that was a big shift to the industry as well. So usually blackberries are planted on mulches. They usually use plastic mulches to suppress weed. And as you can see, I don't know, some people uses white plastic, some people uses black plastic. I think it's all depending on the availability. So now going more deep into blackberry production and the cultivars, you know, that you can come across if you decide to plant a blackberry. So as I said, you know, all of these varieties that I'm going to mention here, they all come from the Arkansas breeding program. Georgia has mainly floricane fruiting varieties, meaning that the floricane was a primocane the year before. And Washita, it's a very popular variety. Very popular variety planted in Georgia. It's a variety that has high yield. So that's why producers prefer that variety. It's a variety that is easy to manage and just produce good, you know, good quantity of berries. However, there is, you know, in the recent years, there were other new varieties that growers got interested on, and those varieties are Osage, Caro, and Ponca. I do have an experimental plot testing different cultivars of blackberries from the Oregon breeding program, which is the other larger blackberry breeding program in the United States. And I also have a test plot looking at how, if we can grow those primocane blackberries here. So, you know, probably if I get invited to give this presentation in next year, I will have some results on that trial. But so why is important to test these varieties here, and what is important to know how they perform here? It's because when something is bred in a different part of the world or in a different part of the country, their plant it's not exposed to different conditions. And that kind of like ties with what I mentioned at the beginning, right? It's very important to know the microclimate, the microclimate, the size, the location, and everything, because that affects how plant is going to develop and how it's going to grow. So for example, in the month of June, when we are harvesting blackberries here, we get about 27 degrees Celsius. And compared to, you know, Arkansas, that we get about 26 degrees Celsius. So precipitation is also high in Arkansas. It's also lower in Arkansas compared to the precipitation that we have here in Georgia when we are harvesting blackberries. So those things affect the production of blackberries, you know, how the plant is going to perform, and it's going to affect the quality of the fruit. And, you know, it's very important to look at how these environmental differences, it's going to affect fruit quality, because at the end, we want the consumer to have good quality fruit, so they keep demanding for those blackberries, right? Because remember how we saw in the first slide how, you know, demand for blackberries is increasing. Well, it is increasing because we have good genetic material, we have good fruit quality that is reaching the consumers, and the consumers are coming back to keep buying more. So on this part of my research also, you know, centers on understanding how all these varieties that are bred in different areas of the U.S. will, you know, perform here in Florida, and what it's that the quality of the fruit is going to be grown in, you know, under, you know, high humidity, high precipitation, and, you know, higher temperature. So One of the objectives for this research was to assess the physicochemical attributes and sensory attributes of these 4 blackberry varieties. So Washita, which is the most common variety grown in Georgia, how will that perform compared to these other new varieties that growers were trying the growers were planting. And I also did some portion of, and this is part of one of my graduate students' research work, in understanding kind of like the volatile, the aroma compound of these 4 blackberry varieties. So what is an aroma? The aroma, it's something when we eat, that flavor compound that we get, it's coming from 2 sides of our bodies. One is our mouth, and one is the olfactory system. So those volatiles, when we eat, as we chew the fruit, as we masticate, that fruit is going to be releasing volatile aroma compounds that go into a retronasal pathway, on a retronasal path, and then there is right here where we sense those aromas. And the mix of the taste that we have with our tongue, with that aromas that were sensed by our olfactory system that is in the back of our mouth, are going to give us the flavor. And that is very important because flavor gets changed depending upon the environmental conditions plants will grow. So we had the 4 cultivars, and we make panelists test these blackberries 2 times. As you can see there in the picture, people, testing the blackberries, tasting the blackberries and scoring. They wrote if they like it, how much they like it, why they didn't like it. And then we correlate this to the attributes that were measured, using equipment, fruit quality measurements such as Brix, which is actually how the amount of sugars each of the varieties had. We also measure the firmness, like how firm, when you bite into something, if it's crunchy, if it's hard, if it's soft. We also measure the titratable acidity, because all of these fruits have acids, right? Sometimes we eat something and we say like, oh, it's very acidic, ooh, we don't like it. It's because that acid content, it's very high, and it has to be a balance between the amount of sugars of sweet and the acidity for us to like it. So we did all of that, and what we found out was that actually one of the largest berry is the Caro cultivar. So Caro outperformed Washita. As you can see, it was a big berry, and I'll show you on the pictures how big it was. But Ponca was firmer. Actually, Ponca had was firmer than Washita, and firmer than Caro as well. And why is firmness important? So firmness is the way that when we bite into it, as I said, we sense how hard it is, how soft it is, and that is important because we want that firmness. We don't like to eat something that is smush. So if we have a berry that has a higher firmness, then it's going to be a berry that also will stand a little bit more in transit until it gets to the consumer. So for the second harvest, we had a Washita actually that had a higher firmness, and the higher berry size was Caro again. So the berry weight, as you can see, Ponca was kind of like the smallest berry that we found from all those berries. Caro was again had a higher berry weight on the second harvest. We harvested twice. The panelists tested twice as well. And then we're gonna go to the total soluble solids. So Washita had the less amount of sugars in harvest 1 and in harvest 2. So when we harvested on those 2 harvests, were different dates, different climate conditions, and everything on those 2 harvests, but Washita was always having the less sugars. So if you want to have a good if you like a sweet berry, I would probably recommend planting, either Osage or Caro or Ponca, instead of Washita. If you're a grower, and you have higher yields, then you will definitely go with the Washita, right? The tetralevel acidity, again, it was higher for Washita, which it's actually something that we were expected based on the sugars that the Washita had. Washita had less sugars and it was more acidic. And now we have these two results, and we're gonna see what the panelists that we gave these varieties to test told us about it. So when they were testing, they saw, as you can see here, Washita was less sweet. So what we measure with those equipments that I showed you on the previous slide told us that actually, yes, Washita has high acidity, and our panelists tasted that, in perceived that when they taste all of these four varieties. So Washita there, you can see, is less sweet than the other varieties. So also in the second sensory evaluation, we saw exactly the same trend, which, if you remember from the previous slides, we had Washita at the same amount of sweetness, right? Didn't change the sweetness. So we continue to see that on the second sensory evaluation that we had. So also here, we asked the panelists to tell us some descriptors on the aromatics of the fruit that they tasted. So if you can see there, the blue is Washita. You have each of the aromatics that they describe on the x-axis, and then you have that percentage of people that told us, what these descriptors were for each variety. So you have, they say, for example, floral. So Washita has less floral aromatics compared to Osage that had the most. And then if you go to citric, Washita had the highest citric. So higher amount of, so there was a higher number of panelists that mentioned that Washita was citric. And if you remember from the previous slide, Washita had higher amount of acidity when we measure it. So that kind of that is why sensory evaluations are very important to help us discern how consumers can perceive the fruit and what they can sense and what they can taste, and if that actually correlates to what we measure in the lab. So as you can see there, we have the same trend on that sensory evaluation tool, in which Washita had less floral amount, and usually floral amount is related to sweetness, and a higher citric amount, and it was described as citric by the panelists. So this is just a little bit more going into kind of like the science of volatile compounds. As you can see there, for example, there is hexanol. It is something that we're related to kind of like a green note, like a kind of like a grass type of smell. And in there, you can see that Caro had a higher amount of hexanol. So here are the varieties that we test. That is Osage and Ponca. And then this is Caro. As I mentioned, Caro has a really, really big berry, and it definitely stands out compared to the other cultivars. Now moving on to how we preserve these blackberries. So after we harvested the blackberries, so first, we decided, okay, we decided for a good soil, we know our soil characteristics, we took good care of the soil, we did all that we were supposed to do, then we choose the right variety, and now that right variety that we took care of it, now we're harvesting the fruit. So what happens now after we harvest the fruit? We have to preserve that quality, right? So everything that we do, that we call it pre-harvest practices, like what we do before we harvest, everything, it's very important, because that it's going to give us a berry with either good quality or bad quality, because quality is not going to change. If we have a very acidic berry, it's not going to be sweeter if we leave it for 2 more days, maybe in the plant. Or if we harvest it and put it in the refrigerator for more. The quality does not change. We get the quality that we get after, when we harvest. But it's very important to know that all of these products are alive. They are respiring after we harvest. So we need to preserve this. And also what we need to do is that we need to reduce the temperature of, of that fruit to preserve it, because all the metabolic processes in a berry, in a blackberry, in this case, are going to be exacerbated if we have this berry in a higher temperature. So the only way to slow down the process of deterioration of the fruit that we harvest is by reducing the temperature. So that's why we put everything in the refrigerator, and that is why after we harvest, everything goes in a cold storage, and then it is cold all the way until we buy it from the store. But how do we know when is the best time to harvest of blackberries? Well, the blackberries have to harvest when they're completely fully dark. We cannot, if we see some of those druplets that are not completely dark, then the fruit is not going to taste very good. So the blackberries have to be harvested and put in a container, and they cannot be touched or they cannot be moved that much, because they easily leak, they easily get bruised, and then they won't taste very good. So also, when we store that in the either refrigerator or in a cold storage, that blackberry, it's not going to change, as I said, it's not going to change its flavor, because there is no sugars in that berry. This is different from other fruits, because, for example, if we leave, let's say, a mango to ripe, it will ripe and it will probably be sweeter. But it does not happen with blackberries, because they don't have any carbohydrates. They don't have any sugars where they can respire. So also, there is also something very important to talk about blackberries. And this is something probably that you might see it if you bought blackberries at the store. Sometimes you buy the blackberries and they're completely dark and they look really pretty, and then you put them in the refrigerator at your house, and then 2 days after they turn red. So that is something that is called red drupeler regression. And what is red drupeler regression? It's the changing from those black druplets to being red. And it is not very well understood why that happens, but a lot of it says that it is those druplets that change on temperature causes changes at the cellular level in those druplets, and in those anthocyanins leak. Anthocyanin is a pigment that makes the blackberries black, and that there is anthocyanins on the cellular level. They leak, and then they turn red. Those druplets turn red again. So a lot of it has to do with the temperature that the blackberries are exposed. Also, some of it had to do with the temperature they're exposed at harvest. Some of it could be also due to some management practices in the field. That could be probably higher nitrogen applications when they fertilize were higher nitrogen rates. That could also cause red drupeler regression. And here you can see how that how red drupeler regression looks. There is also some other disorder called white drupeler regression, white druplet, as you can see in that in the picture on the top, on the right part of your screen. So all of these are, of course, not liked by the consumer. The consumer, seems to look at these and thinks that they're probably unripe, that the berries are not fully ripe, even though when they bought it, it's black. So there are several ways to preserve, and this is for the commercial operations. Blackberries could be preserved in controlled atmosphere, and these are places in which you take out the oxygen and you pump nitrogen, and they can be preserved that way for a longer period. However, the perishability of blackberry is very limited. However, it used to be, back probably 5 years ago, that blackberries only last 14 days. Now, with new cultivars and new varieties, it seems that we can hold a blackberry for 21 days. So these are some recommendations for the storage conditions, and that optimal temperature to storage blackberries are 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And you need probably 90 to 95% humidity for that. They don't release a lot of ethylene, which is a hormone that is a plant hormone that when fruits ripen, they start generating this. They synthesize this ethylene and makes other fruits also ripe. I don't know if you notice when you put if you put an apple next to a banana, or you put them both to, if you have a green banana and you put an apple there, the banana is going to start ripening faster because of that ethylene. That is a plant hormone that it's released by fruits when they start ripening. So also, as I said, controlled atmosphere is used to preserve blackberries in large scale operation. It is not used here in Georgia. And with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.